My name's Aron Ralston. My parents are Don and Larry Ralston of Englewood, Colorado. Whoever finds this, please make an attempt to get it to them. Be sure of it. I would appreciate it.
Some people survive shark attacks. Some survive avalanches. But what about silence, darkness, being utterly alone? This is not about superhumans. It's about three real men in a canyon, on a mountain, and under Antarctic ice who came face to face with death and found a way back. There are places where the land doesn't forgive mistakes, where the air is dry, the sun doesn't blink, and the silence feels ancient. In these places, if something goes wrong, there's no one to hear you scream, no road signs, no hikers passing by. Just you, the stone, and time. On the morning of April 26, 2003, Aron Ralston set out for a solo trek through Blue John Canyon, a remote sandstone labyrinth carved into the Utah desert. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He often didn't. At 27, he was strong, well-trained, and used to pushing limits. He had summited peaks in Colorado alone, mountain biked off-trail, and treated nature as both his playground and teacher. Risk wasn't a thrill for him. It was part of the experience. That morning, the weather was clear. Spring in the desert meant warm days, cold nights. Aron packed light, a liter of water, a couple of burritos, some energy bars, a headlamp, climbing gear, and his small multi-tool knife. No phone, no GPS, no one expecting him home. By early afternoon, he had descended deep into the slot canyons, weaving through narrow stone corridors barely wide enough for his shoulders. In one of these tight descents, as he lowered himself between two boulders, he dislodged a rock. It was sudden. The boulder, weighing over 360 kilograms, shifted as he stepped onto it. In a heartbeat, it tumbled downward and crushed his right arm against the canyon wall. The sound of it hitting echoed like a door slamming shut. And just like that, he was trapped. No movement, no leverage. His arm pinned by a slab of ancient sandstone. No cell signal, no way out. At first, he did what any skilled climber would do. He tried everything. He pulled, twisted, and braced his legs against the canyon walls. He used his gear to rig makeshift levers. He even tried to chip away at the rock, but nothing worked. The boulder wasn't going anywhere. By nightfall, reality set in. He was stuck, completely alone, in a crack in the earth, with barely a liter of water and no rescue on the horizon. No one would report him missing. No one knew he was out there. What followed was 5 days and 7 hours of brutal survival. The nights were freezing. The desert heat gave way to biting cold that cut through his thin clothes. He had no sleeping bag, no insulation, just his body heat and the shallow cave of rock that held him captive. During the day, the sun returned with force. The sandstone absorbed and radiated the heat, turning the narrow canyon into an oven. Aron rationed his water, sipped slowly, and counted every drop. By day 3, the bottle was empty. He began drinking his own urine. Slowly, deliberately, knowing it would only delay the inevitable. His body weakened. He lost over 18 kilograms in less than a week. His right arm, trapped without circulation, had begun to die. First numb, then swollen, then gray. But Aron's mind didn't give in. He filmed messages on his camera, speaking directly to his family, apologizing for past mistakes, telling them he loved them. He carved his name and date of birth into the canyon wall, followed by what he thought would be the date of his death. He even recorded his final will, using the camera as a confessional. Still, he didn't stop thinking, didn't stop calculating. He explored every possibility. Could he break the rock, dig around it, use climbing gear as leverage? Could he amputate? The idea of cutting off his arm came early, but he had no sharp blade, just a dull multi-tool, and bone doesn't yield easily. He tried to cut through the flesh, but when he reached the bone, the knife stopped cold. There was no way through. It wasn't until the morning of the 6th day that something changed. Weak, delirious, and on the edge of death, Aron had a vision. He saw himself holding a child, a future son, and walking away from the canyon. It wasn't just a hallucination. It felt real, like a promise, and somehow that vision gave him the strength to try again. This time, he didn't try to cut through the bone, he broke it. Using his trapped arm like a lever, he torqued it against the rock until he heard a snap, then another. The radius and ulna cracked under the pressure of his own weight. Then, with his left hand, he took the knife and began to work. He cut through the skin, through the tendons, through the muscle. At one point, he had to use the pliers on the knife to tear apart the tougher tissue. The pain was unimaginable, but also dulled by dehydration, exhaustion, and the fact that the limb was already dying. The entire operation lasted nearly an hour. When he was done, he was free, but freedom didn't mean safety. He was still 20 meters above the canyon floor, so he rigged his gear and rappelled down the sheer rock wall. One-armed, bleeding, and barely conscious. Then he walked. For nearly 10 kilometers through the desert sun with his arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage, hoping to find help before it was too late. That help came in the form of a Dutch family hiking through the canyon. They gave him water, alerted authorities, and stayed with him until a rescue helicopter arrived hours later. He was airlifted to a hospital where surgeons treated his wounds and stabilized him. He had lost nearly 25% of his blood. He was malnourished, dangerously dehydrated, and had a severe infection risk. But he was alive. Aron Ralston's story made headlines across the world. He published a memoir, Between a Rock and a Hard Place, which became a bestseller. His ordeal was adapted into the film 127 Hours, directed by Danny Boyle, with James Franco playing Aron. The movie was praised for its raw honesty and for not shying away from the physical and psychological toll of what he endured. But what matters most isn't what was published or filmed, it's what happened afterward. Ralston didn't retreat from life. He kept climbing. He traveled. He became a speaker, sharing his story not to glorify suffering but to explore what it means to survive, what we're capable of when the choice is simple, live or die. He married, had a son, the very child he had envisioned in the canyon, and built a new life, shaped forever by that narrow crack in the Utah rock. In the end, Aron Ralston didn't survive because he was fearless. He survived because he faced fear with clarity. He planned, he adapted, he endured, and when the time came, he did what had to be done. Not because he wanted to, but because it was the only way forward. Now imagine this. Would you have been able to cut off your own arm to survive? To stop your fall with an ice axe, one heartbeat from death? Or to stay sane, completely alone, in total darkness, for 5 months? If those questions make you pause, subscribe, and stay with me until the end. Some stories are about luck. This one is about will. There are mountains that don't tolerate arrogance. K2 is one of them. At 8,611 meters, it's the second highest peak on Earth, but in many ways, it's more dangerous than Everest, steeper, colder, less forgiving. Climbers call it the Savage Mountain for a reason. 1 out of every 4 who reach its summit never makes it back down. In the summer of 1992, Ed Viesturs, already an accomplished American alpinist, joined an international expedition to K2. His partner was Scott Fisher, another strong and ambitious climber. Together, they shared a simple but serious principle. Reaching the summit is optional. Returning is mandatory. At high altitude, nothing happens quickly. Every movement feels heavy. Every breath is thin. Storms can sweep in without warning, and the line between progress and disaster is razor thin. But Ed and his team were moving well. After weeks of acclimatization, they had reached high camp, just beneath the summit, preparing for their final push. That's when they received a call for help. Another climber, the French alpinist Chantal Mauduit, had collapsed near the top. She was suffering from snow blindness, a painful condition that turns the world into blinding white and leaves you nearly sightless. Exhausted and disoriented, she couldn't make it down on her own. Her life was now in the hands of others. Viesturs and Fisher volunteered to help. They knew what it meant, delaying their own descent, risking exposure, and pushing their already depleted bodies deeper into the death zone, that altitude above 8,000 meters, where the human body begins to shut down. There is no recovery up there, only survival. They reached Chantal, guided her carefully, step by step, down the steep slope towards safety. But as they moved along the upper face of K2, something shifted. The snow beneath them, loosely packed and dry, gave way. It wasn't a roar, not like in the movies. It was more of a soft, sudden collapse, a spindrift avalanche, a wave of powder snow, cascading silently but violently down the mountain's face. Viesturs and Fisher were roped together, about 15 meters apart. When the avalanche hit, both men were swept off their feet and carried down the slope. They fell for nearly 60 meters, dragged like rag dolls across the snow, accelerating toward a vertical drop of 2,400 meters, a fall that no one survives. And yet, in that chaos, something extraordinary happened. Instinct took over. As he tumbled, Viesturs managed to twist his body, reach out with his ice axe, and slam it into the snow. It held. The rope went tight. The fall stopped. Just like that, they were alive, still roped together, still clinging to the face of K2, shaken, breathless, but alive. They scrambled to regain footing, checked each other for injuries. Fisher had dislocated a shoulder, but could still move. Viesturs was stunned, but intact. They had escaped what should have been a fatal accident by seconds and inches. The mountain had given them a second chance. They didn't waste it. They continued their descent slowly, carefully, bringing Chantal down with them. The rescue wasn't over. They had to navigate technical terrain, battle high winds, and manage exhaustion without supplemental oxygen. Viesturs, in particular, had never used bottled oxygen, by choice, which meant his body was always working in deficit, even in rest. Eventually they reached Camp 1 where other climbers took over. From there, the group was able to descend safely to base camp. Everyone survived. No one lost a finger, a toe, or a limb, a rare outcome on K2, where even the lucky ones often return with frostbite or worse. But the survival wasn't just physical, it was also mental. Viesturs later said that fear, in the mountains, isn't the enemy, it's the guide. When you stop being afraid, you stop being careful. What saved him that day wasn't superhuman strength or blind courage. It was awareness, discipline, the ability to stay calm in panic, to react with precision when most would freeze or flail. He remembers the avalanche in fragments, the hiss of snow, the sharp tug of the rope, the cold bite of the wind, and the moment his axe caught, not as a triumph, but as a moment of disbelief. He hadn't expected to stop. And yet, there he was, pressed into the slope, heart pounding, alive. The experience didn't stop him from climbing. In fact, it deepened his resolve. Over the years, Ed Viesturs would go on to summit all 14 of the world's 8,000-meter peaks without supplemental oxygen, a feat that only a handful of climbers have achieved. He did it slowly, carefully, never rushing, always listening to the mountain, and always prepared to turn around. Because for him, the summit was never the point, survival was. The 1992 rescue on K2 became legendary in the climbing world. Viesturs received the Souls Award from the American Alpine Club for his role in saving Chantal Mauduit. But he never described it as heroism. In his words, it was simply what needed to be done. He later told interviewers that one of the most valuable skills in mountaineering is knowing when to say no, knowing when to turn back. Getting to the top is optional, he wrote in his book, No Shortcuts to the Top. Getting down is mandatory. Many of his closest friends would die in the mountains, including Scott Fisher, just 4 years later, on Everest. The loss weighed heavily on him, not as fear, but as respect. Respect for the danger, the unpredictability, and the cost that comes with chasing summits. What happened on K2 in 1992 is not the most famous survival story in alpinism. No limbs were lost, no one was stranded for days. But in a world where the line between glory and death is paper thin, sometimes the most powerful stories are the quiet ones, the moments when things could have gone terribly wrong, but didn't. Because someone planted their axe. Because someone didn't panic. Because someone knew what the mountain demanded. In the high places of the world, you don't survive by being fearless. You survive by being humble. In the depths of Antarctica, winter doesn't come gradually. It descends like a curtain. The sun disappears for months, the cold tightens its grip, and the wind becomes the only voice left in the world. In March 1934, Richard E. Byrd, a seasoned explorer, naval officer, and national hero, made a decision few understood. He would spend the winter entirely alone, 200 kilometers from the main expedition base, inside a small shack buried under the Antarctic snow. They called it Advance Base, a one-room station dug into the ice cap, outfitted with a stove, a generator, and a radio. Just big enough for one man to stand, sleep, and work. It had been designed for a 3-person crew, but due to limited supplies and logistical constraints, Byrd insisted on going alone. He believed solitude would offer clarity, and that science demanded risk. He wanted to study weather patterns firsthand, to push the limits of endurance, to see what one human mind could withstand in complete isolation. At first, the experiment felt controlled. He maintained routines, took meteorological readings, recorded data, kept a diary. He listened to music on scratchy phonograph records, read books by lantern light, and sent short messages in Morse code back to Little America, the main base, where his team awaited the return of spring. But Antarctica has its own plans. Roughly 2 months into his isolation, Byrd began to feel strange. He had headaches, dizziness, nausea. His coordination faltered. At first he thought it was just fatigue, the result of long nights and the biting cold. But then came blackouts, disorientation. He would wake on the floor with no memory of how he got there. The cause was invisible, carbon monoxide. The ventilation system had iced over. Exhaust fumes from the stove and generator had begun leaking into the shack, slowly poisoning him. In a space so tightly sealed against the cold, even a small accumulation of gas was enough to turn the air toxic. But Byrd didn't call for help, not right away, partly because he didn't want to endanger his team. A rescue mission across the crevasse-ridden ice during the Antarctic night would be almost suicidal, and partly because, in his own words, he didn't yet believe he was dying, or didn't want to believe it. So he stayed, and declined. His journal from that period shifts in tone. The entries become shorter, less coherent. He admits to hallucinations, seeing figures in the corners, hearing voices, dreaming while awake. He writes of the silence as a physical presence, of conversations with people who weren't there, of snow that whispered things he didn't understand. Physically, his body was failing. He lost over 27 kilograms. His fingers stiffened. His breathing became shallow. Preparing food became an ordeal. Melting ice for water was exhausting. At times, he couldn't even light the stove, choosing instead to stay in bed and hope the temperature wouldn't drop too low that night. Mentally, he clung to routine. Even as he deteriorated, he continued sending weather data, continued writing, even if just a few lines. He tried to keep track of time. He listened to the wind like it was a signal, a reminder that the world outside was still real. Radio contact with Little America became erratic. At first, Byrd downplayed his condition. He didn't want to worry the crew, but eventually, his messages grew stranger, less structured, until the team realized something was very wrong. Twice, they attempted to reach him, and twice, storms forced them to turn back. It wasn't until late August, near the end of the polar night, that a rescue team led by Dr. Thomas Poulter finally made it to Advance Base. They used a tractor to cross the treacherous ice, under the pretense of performing routine checks. What they found was a man near collapse. Byrd was weak, underweight, barely able to stand. He had been operating on sheer willpower, kept alive not by strength, but by discipline. The rescuers stayed with him for nearly 2 months, helping him recover. He was eventually flown out once the weather cleared enough for a safe evacuation. By then, he had been alone for 5 months, in temperatures below -70 degrees Celsius, in complete darkness, with poisoned air, failing strength, and no assurance that help would arrive. He survived. Not because he fought the environment, but because he adapted to it. He accepted the silence, the cold, the solitude. He found ways to remain alert without giving in to fear. He wrote, he listened, he endured. His experience became legendary. Byrd published a memoir, Alone, in 1938. It wasn't a tale of heroics or conquest. It was a study in solitude, raw, honest, and haunting. He described the sound of the wind rattling the shack, the ice creeping down the walls, the quiet dread of hearing your own heartbeat in a space so still it felt like death. He spoke about humility, about the mind's capacity to twist itself when deprived of light and warmth and other people. He spoke about moments of peace, too, of standing outside under the stars, in the brief times when the weather allowed it, and feeling not alone but connected, as if the universe, vast and frozen, still had a place for him. There's something profound in what Byrd endured. He wasn't battling a wild animal or escaping a dramatic accident. He was simply surviving time, space, and the slow erosion of self that comes when no one else is there to reflect you back. His story would go on to influence research on isolation, from polar stations to submarines to space missions. NASA has cited Alone as essential reading. It remains one of the most psychologically honest accounts of what long-term solitude does to the human mind. But Byrd himself never claimed to be extraordinary. He considered what he did to be a matter of duty, to science, to exploration, to something bigger than comfort. In the end, Richard Byrd's survival wasn't just physical, it was philosophical, a quiet, determined refusal to vanish into silence. A man surrounded by ice and darkness, who chose to write, to observe, and to wait, even as his body failed him. There are many kinds of survival. This one happened slowly, one breath at a time, one entry in a journal, one night closer to spring. In the end, none of them were rescued by chance. They were rescued by choice, by the quiet decision, moment after moment, to stay alive. Whether pinned by stone, hanging by an axe, or slipping into darkness, they all chose presence. They all refused to disappear. And maybe that's the hardest survival of all.